Speaking of alive and live,
Uh-oh. What are you going to tell me?
I'm going to say Kiss is an underappreciated band in our generation.
Totally disagree. And we weren't supposed to disagree on this show.
We were not supposed to disagree. How's everybody doing? Give us a thumbs up if you can hear us. Let us
Hold
know
on a second.
what's the matter.
We got some kind of weird echo going on.
Is that because you have...
I've never heard it before.
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
Let me see here.
It's a crazy reverb. That's what we got going on.
Stereo mix, audio interface. I don't know.
Jeff says awful, Dan.
Let me just turn this off real quick and turn it back on.
Okay.
All right, so now we're going to go to the audio input on the laptop. And then we're going to flip this back on.
Oh, it says no echo there.
All right, so I'm going to try this one more time because now we're talking into this guy right here, yeah? All right, now we flipped it back on.
Brills. Nick Huggins. Howdy.
All right. Is it back on?
Stankovic. We good?
What's everybody think?
I think it's just my computer, man. Screw it. Everybody says it sounds good.
It sounds good? Everybody good?
We're good.
All right, we are good.
I think we're on the main mics now, too.
So Ian and I have a running joke here at the Ranchette, and the joke goes something like this. You know, all these terrible things are happening in the economy. Like, it's the worst thing since the Great Depression, whatever. What's the punchline?
Stonks are up.
Stonks are up.
Stonks are still up.
It's like, so we've been telling this joke for weeks now. It's like, terrible thing happened. Stocks are up. And then this morning, CNN had it as its headline. It was like...
Did they say stocks or stonks?
So they said stocks,
okay.
But I thought stonks. And it was funny because it was basically like, look, this is the worst since the Great Depression. The worst in almost 100 years. Stocks are up.
Yeah.
Incredible. Bitcoin up.
Gold.
I don't know about gold.
Up.
How's everybody doing? One thing I've noticed is, we're going to just warm up a little bit, and then we have a couple topics we want to share with you guys, and then we're going to do some Q&A. Cheers to everybody.
Happy Friday.
We had a very productive week. This is some Waterloo grapefruit flavor. Here at the ranch, I've cornered the market on the grapefruit flavor due to the fact that Ian doesn't like it very much, so that's all that I order.
That's how you ensure that you get to drink it.
You know, it's been interesting to watch. I know a lot of you guys, we're on the build and buy side. You know, this is the build and buy side podcast. And I've been very curious on the market, looking at luxury goods, looking at real estate, looking at traditional assets. And I've noticed this thing where there was this like little bit of a pop unload and then a hold. And now what I'm seeing is stuff starting to trickle onto the market. So one specific example, and I'm curious if you guys have seen the same thing in markets that you watch. For a few years now, there's one part in South Austin that I've been looking for condos and homes. And I always have the same search parameters, and I put my map over the same part of the map. And over the past couple of years, it's been about less than 10 properties every time I do it. And finally, it was this week that I put it over the same area, and there was 30 properties. So over a 3x thing. And we've been talking a lot about this. My kind of thought over the past month has been, if you're holding something right now that you don't want to hold for the next very long period of time, you'd be crazy not to sell it. But also, I totally understand the emotion that sellers have of like, taking a loss is super emotionally difficult right now. And given there's uncertainty and given the whole country seems to be just waiting for everything to, quote, open back up, I can understand why people aren't unloading as fast as I think me and you expected. And all of us, I think that's been the chorus here, is we've sort of expected people to sell faster. And I think it makes sense to me that these things are going to just leak onto the market slowly over the next year.
Couple things with houses. Summer is the time when people they sell the most houses, I think, or it's one of the more popular times because the kids are out of school basically, and so when you change your house, maybe they're going to go to a new school district. So it's the least sensitive time to uproot a child. So I think a lot of houses go on the market in the summertime. So some of this 3x could be that, but there's no doubt that I'm seeing more availability in certain things too. Now that being said, I don't think you should sell right now unless you have to. And so I think if you see something on the market, regardless if it's a watch, a car, a house, whatever it is, there's a good chance that person has to sell right now.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about holding, I think it would be a good idea to go into this next couple months holding anything you want to own for the next 5 to 10 years, because there is a very good chance that you may not be able to unload it for a reasonable price. Like you could take a 50% hit on it, for example. So I don't know if this window's closed. I don't know if this window's real. This is all speculation. Interested to hear what you guys say, but it's just what I feel. It's what I've noticed. I think there still might be a little bit of a window when you can get rid of some of these things that you might want to dump right now and not lose your ass on it. But in general, like everything I have right now, I'm holding for like 5 to 10 years.
Right. Like, and maybe a lot of you guys can relate out there, like in the evenings, instead of playing role-playing games, like this is sort of the fun game to play is instead of video games, or it's figuring out where the price of different assets is. And it's a decent rule of thumb for most things. Like the reason we call them assets, I guess, in this case, is that they're not that volatile. And that's basically the whole point. And so for most assets, if you don't plan to hold them for 5 years, what's really the point?
Mm-hmm.
Unless you have a very specific expertise or use case or whatever. I think it's a decent rule in entrepreneurship. Don't do the business if you don't want to be on stage in 5 years. Don't do the business if you don't want to work on it for 5 hours a day. And don't buy the asset if you don't want to hold it for 5 years. I think we're coming up with a little bit of a pet theory here. Don't do a TMBA podcast if you don't have 5 points. Right, we're going to do a little bit of a TMBA podcast behind the scenes as well. And today what we want to do is share 3 1,000-day lessons from you guys, the audience, that were shared with us last week.
A couple things in the comments here before we get rolling. And at the end, we're going to do Q&A. Mike Stankovich bought some gold and silver. I love it. Gold in silver. That's awesome. Churchbanners.com. Man, that's such an old school way to get me to say churchbanners.com.
Church banner.
Instead of your name. Churchbanners.com. Enjoying a 0% beer. Man, I need to figure out this market. I heard actually from Noah Kagan, who did a call with our community last night inside of the DC. Thanks,
Shout
Noah.
out Noah Kagan.
He said the Lagunitas is the best non-alcoholic beer he's ever tasted. I got to get my hands on a
We got to try the Lagunitas. Yes, shout out to the non-alcoholic beer. We want to bring more of that into our community. We want to get free samples here at the Podshop.
Final thing before we get rolling here, Jeff, thanks for showing up. He makes a note, and I think this is good. Unemployment numbers, they think are on par with the Depression, but numbers were not being tracked then. I think that you're probably right.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the numbers are showing up too for us is like, you have to be a pretty high class relative person to apply for unemployment in some respects, or you have to be out of the gig economy. There's just so many people that wouldn't apply for unemployment that may not be producing value at the current time or may not be making money. So that's the other thing that's interesting about that. All right. So like Ian said, we're going to do a little bit of Q&A. And for those of you who listen to the pod, we're going to do some backstory on some recent episodes. But if you look down into the comments, we have a share your 1,000-day link. The 1,000-day principle suggests it'll take you 3 years of full-time effort to replace your income, your corporate income, with a business of your own. The 1,000-day principle also suggests that it's going to be a big pain in the butt during those 3 years. And so most people aren't going to do it. They're going to go back to a job. And we also found that it takes a lot of days just to get to that privilege of going through the difficult gauntlet of the 1,000-day principles. And one of the things we're doing is exploring this pattern with you, the listeners. And last week, some folks shared their stories with using the link below. We are offering in return very little, a shout out, a sincere thanks, but also a backlink for those of you who want to go public with your story. Today, we've chosen 3 of those stories, and we want to use them to talk about different elements of the 1,000-day principle. So you ready for this one, boss man?
I'm ready.
The first story that was shared was by Mitko from That Remote Life podcast. And Mitko's on day 31 and has spent a great deal of time apprenticing and working in other people's businesses to get to that privileged moment where, Mitko, now you really got to feel the pain in your own pocketbook for 3 years. Good luck.
And again, just to let everybody know, day 1 is the day that you make your first sale.
That's right.
So he's 30 days into that.
Yeah. And he's a lot more days into running a podcast about digital nomadism. I want to give a shout out to that pod. I mentioned this to Ian completely unsolicited before we were going over this, that I think Mitko's a really talented podcast host, and he's a step above the rest. So don't let that get to your head in your 1,000 days. You're going to be humbled like the rest of us. But definitely Mitko's a guy who has talent, and he asks us, how big does your 1,000 day pivot have to be in order to start over? So the concern is this. It's sort of like if you watch the movie Groundhog Day, the number one question you ask is, well, why didn't Bill Murray just stay up all night long to see what happens? And one of the first questions we get about the 1,000 day principle is, well, if your business fails, do you have to go back to start zero, or are there parlay opportunities? And it's a great question because the answer is, who knows what would happen if Bill Murray stayed up all night long? We didn't go quite that way. And the thing about life is, you don't really know until you go out there and do it with this business stuff. And I think what most entrepreneurs say typically is that they don't regret their failures because they tend to lead to a connection, a resource, an insight,
a skill set.
Yeah, but you're often talking to the people who are at success point. And so they weren't the ones that felt like they were always going back to day zero. They were the ones that they always saw a hustle, a parlay, a relationship where they were able to hop, skip, and a jump and get to their 1,000 days efficiently, as opposed to a fragile plan that maybe sometimes it can happen if you isolate yourself, and you're not really involving others in what you're doing, and so they can't help you. It's the biggest thing, that maybe the hidden story behind so many 1,000 day success principles or stories is the amount of help people received from others.
Or how public you make your journey. The more public your journey is, the more people can help you. I was just thinking through this exercise, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this, Dan, but imagine yourself and you lose your audience. You lose your audience, your mailing list, right? So you have nobody to sell to, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
How long do you think it would take you in days to be able to sell a product?
7 days.
That was my answer too, which is crazy. But I think that's just a testament to going through the 1,000 day principle several times, which is now I feel like I can do it in 7 days, which is crazy. Right? I can dream up a product. I can make a product, a service, whatever it is. I can find an audience. I can market it to them, and then I can sell it to them in 7 days. I think that's pretty. We should do this challenge, actually.
I'll say this: it's an interesting challenge, and it's one that we were just talking on a team call the other day, and I was talking to Alex, and I was trying to demonstrate this, and I don't even know if I was right, but I was like, "Hey, man, I can do this project, and I can do this." It's like I have this arrogance as an entrepreneur that I really feel like I've got the skill set to do something. We were talking about what it would take for us to become investors. We're thinking about maybe investing in some young companies. And we talked about how important that founder was. And Travis Jameson mirrored something where he was saying, I think in the negative, but he was sort of like, Travis is a really becoming an experienced investor. And he said, look, at a certain point, a business is the founder.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something true about, of course, you don't want to end it up being the founder. You want to, create systems and all that. But the reality is it's so true for so many of our businesses that they really are reflections of the founder. And, even Vern Harnish reflects on this principle where when firms get to the point of around 50 employees, the firm tends to be really weak where the founder is strong.
Mm-hmm.
So if this founder is this amazing salesperson, they typically don't externalize it into a system because it's like they just crushed. I mean, we've been a part of organizations where the founder was just a force of nature, so good at what they did, and they could feed 50 people because they were that good, but that doesn't mean that you can then turn that into a sellable asset. But the original point here is that it is about developing that skill set, right? And so part of it is going back and looking at that 1,000 day principle post and saying, am I doing the things in sequence? Am I cutting deals? Am I getting clients on contracts and they're not churning out of the business? Am I, there's steps that you got to go through, that once you're through them, you'll never be the same.
Yeah, agree.
Okay, so that was the first story. Mitko's on day 31. The second story was from...
Sorry, Mike Stankovich says, bears a suspicious resemblance to Dan Norris's 7-day startup. Yeah.
So Dan Norris's 7-day startup we should do a whole episode about that. We have, in fact, and I've invited Dan on the show to do a business idea donation podcast where we literally wrote tens. And then in the comments, if you basically, we have over 100 free business ideas at our blog. If you search for this, like Tropical MBA business ideas. And in fact, we just talked about our production meeting that we got to get Dan back on the show because he wrote a new book, which is excellent. So yeah, Dan Norris, shout out. Love his thinking. And in fact, Dan Norris is very relevant, Mike, to this next point. So Jesse Hanley from Bento Now and TalentTree.io, which is a productized service, and Bento Now is a SaaS. So you can check those out, maybe drop them in the comment or whatever. Jesse is on day 1553, and he said, I asked, one of the questions we asked in the format is, what would you change about the 1,000 days? And Jesse wrote, this is tricky, but I often wish that I chose revenue models that were more in line with my personality and emotions. I found myself in often difficult, emotionally turbulent times with other choices. And now my businesses look wildly different to the businesses I started working on. The themes are similar, but these new businesses are calmer, happier, and built with the lessons I learned along the way. Now, I've spoken with Jesse about this in the past. I want to say he moved from a more client-based model to a more product. Certainly, if you look at TalentTree and Bento Now, these are very product-oriented businesses, both technology and productized service. That's one of the things that is a problem with what Mitko's on about, which is if you have to take a big step back, sometimes if you start one sort of business model and then you're like, man, I hate clients, unless you're using one of your dog fooded products or if you built an in-house product, which is the best way to do a service business. Like if you're in fact, this is probably the biggest step back people have to make in 1,000-day journeys, is that they start off with a services model and they end up making too much money from it. And they don't have like the product end game in the mind. So if you look at the services business model, there's countless entrepreneurs who've used it to create an internal product or an internal brand that then turns into their main thing. That to me is the end game for a services business. The problem comes is when you start this amazing law firm and you have all these amazing clients and then you find yourself an amazing job, basically, that then there was no real product end game. And you find a lot of people with those wonderful services businesses fantasizing about starting an affiliate business or some SaaS product or whatever. So back to Mitko's, question, if you're going to start a services business on day one, have a product end game in mind from day one. That's or a product view. Now, fast forwarding to Jesse, this is an issue of founder fit, and it is an issue that Dan Norris talks about a lot, which is what expert podcaster guru has to say about what a good business idea is. Doesn't mean shit if it doesn't resonate with you, because you're the one that has to live these 1,000 days, and that's the idea. Any thoughts from you, boss man?
Motivation matters. If you pick a niche, if you pick a product, if you pick a group of clients that you can't stand working with, or that emotionally doesn't resonate with you, you're not going to work on it. Simple as that. You might work on it for the first 3 years if it means that you don't have to be in that job anymore. And then you'll realize you're in a different kind of shitty situation. You're in your shitty job situation. Now you're in your I own a shitty business situation.
Yeah.
And then you got to figure out a way to pivot out of that. But, hey, sometimes it takes that. Like, is that the worst thing in the world? Like, again, going back to what we talked about just a few minutes ago, is like, well, now you have a skill set. Now you realize that you can control your income and time. Now you realize all the opportunities that are out there, So you didn't pick right the first time. So what?
Yep.
Go back. It's going to take you half the time. Maybe it'll take you 7 days. And you'll pivot into something else that makes more sense for you.
You know what a decent litmus test is like if you like thinking about things that are relevant to your business at like 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. at like the corners of the day, that's not a bad litmus test for if you're curious about it.
Yeah.
If you're genuinely curious, and if you like to tinker around in tangential directions too, I think that those are all really good signs, you know, because it does take that kind of obsession sometimes to get something past this.
You know, this came up in our business, Dan, when we were selling valet parking equipment. And in the beginning, I was super passionate about designing those products and the industry. And then at some point, you just think like, I can't even look at these things anymore. You know, it's like, what am I going to do? I can't design another one of these things. I'm not that passionate about it. So you do two things. One is you hire another designer. And then for me, too, I became obsessed about the business. And like I became obsessed about accounting, cash flow, hiring, management, all these things. So like a new set of problems emerged for me, and it kind of solved my boredom problem in that business. So I think that's often the case in these companies. If you're able to extract yourself, is that you might find new challenges. So, you know, don't be discouraged if you're bored with your product after 2 or 3 years. I think that there's still opportunities in that organization.
Totally. All right. So the final story I want to share is one from Steve from reallygoodbikes.com. He's on day 1150, and he brings up a really another interesting angle. He talked about so many interesting things in his writing. And by the way, I really appreciate if you guys would drop in your story. Again, we're offering backlinks, a sincere thanks. And we're doing a lot of exploring of this concept and how it's played out in the different lives of entrepreneurs and businesses. So for Steve, what he said is, when I was 54 years old, I Googled how to make money online.
That's awesome.
It's fucking crazy. Sorry, excuse my French, and the reason he did it, he said, look, you guys throw around this idea like people can go out there and make $100,000 a year. And he's like, I worked for 30 years. I never made $100,000 a year. And he shared with us that he's on day 1150. And it looks like he's on track to make more this year than he ever made at a job for 30 years.
People riding their bikes these days.
Shout out. Steve said, on January 1st, 2018, having shed most of my worldly belongings, I got in an SUV and began driving south. While the original plan was to slowly travel through Mexico and Central America, I found a lovely spot on the Pacific coast. This sounds like a little bit like Shawshank. And decided after 3 weeks on the road, it was time to settle down for a spell. Anyway, Steve's been living with Mexico as his home base for 2.5 years with trips to Colombia, Argentina, Uruguay, Jamaica, Spain, and the U.S. Shout out, Steve. You know, Steve's point here is that he became unemployable. So he kind of had his back up against the wall. His income had completely topped out. Not only become unemployable from a mindset perspective, but that he was actually mentioned or insinuated that he saw his ability to get the next job going down.
Which is, something that we actually don't talk about at all on this show, but it's basically ageism, and it happens to a lot of people. And, you know, sounds like that might happen to Steve. Was he got to a certain age where it was just like, hey, man, it doesn't necessarily actually have to do with your physical age necessarily, but a lot of times when older people apply for jobs, you think like this person's going to be too expensive. Like they built up this lifestyle. I'm sure I can't afford it. You know, next.
Yep. You know, one of the things Steve mentioned is going from 0 to 1 was an enormous challenge, but I made it through. Online, there's a lot of debates about, you know, Steve started a drop shipping site. There's a Wired article last couple weeks ago about this, and everybody's on the Facebooks, everybody's on the YouTubes talking about drop ship this. Should I do this course? This guy's just saying this because of this. I'll tell you what, Steve didn't have time for any of that, right? Steve was trying to get from 0 to 1, solve a real problem, start a business. You're not going to learn about this stuff by trying to be smarter than the next person on Facebook, right? You're going to learn about it by just sitting there for 4 years and banging on your freaking site.
I got to tell you too, like Steve being 55 or 54 and Googling how to start a business online and then going for it and picking one of the toughest niches there are because,
Yeah.
there's a lot of people selling e-bikes out there and then going out and replacing his income. Like, Steve, in my mind, like, you picked one of the toughest niches. You started from probably negative thousands of days, if that's the way that you were getting into this thing, by Googling how to start a business online. I mean, you basically had the deck stacked against you in every single way. You accomplished it. So congratulations.
Yep.
Final thing I'll say about Steve is today I went on his website and there's a little chat bubble.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, that looks like Steve. So I just started chatting. I was like, is this Steve? He's like, yep. That's hustling, man.
That
is hustling. Friday afternoon, getting it done. This man has some
Steve,
ideas and vision.
Cheers.
Cheers.
That's awesome. Living in Mexico. Cheers to your next 1,000 days. So those are just 3 stories of 1,000-day journeys. We'd love to hear and share yours. Click the link below. Let us know where the theory works, where it doesn't, how we could add some sophistication and perspective to it. That's the point of 1,000-Day Friday.
Couple comments here, and again at the end we're going to do a Q&A, so if you guys have questions, please pop them in there. Kevin Marshall, and this is going back to the idea that a business might not be the right fit for you. He says, then again, there's always ways to convince yourself that a promising business isn't the right fit for you, when it's possible the real reason maybe you're scared to double down on it. Yeah, I think that's totally possible. And there's reasons why you shouldn't double down too. Like, maybe your skill set doesn't align. Maybe you don't have enough traction. Maybe you don't have an unfair advantage.
It could be risky. I've seen a lot of people take like significant risks to double down that maybe didn't make sense or compromise their ability to do future things.
Yeah. So I think you're right, Kevin. We talk ourselves out of a lot of things, and sometimes for good reason, but a lot of times it isn't.
I'll say this, Kevin, you know what's interesting about, I was thinking about how do you get advice in that situation? And we were speaking with Travis Jameson this week. And one of the things that's remarkable about people that have had so much success is often how humble they are about what their next steps are. You know, Travis has a lot more questions than answers. And I think that that's appropriate. Like, these situations are enormously complex. So I'm typically not a fan of the overconfident, like, bluster. There's an obvious thing to do in this situation. For me, I found that tinkering around with businesses and figuring out how to improve them is often, there's a lot of question marks involved.
Yeah. I'm gonna save Andrew's question until the end because it's a little bit unrelated. So let's save that, and everybody else pop your questions in there. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, this is just a short little thing. We wanted to do some behind the scenes of some recent podcast episodes that we've been getting emails about. Recently, we interviewed Gino Wickman from the book Traction, which is one of the most influential. It was one of the most influential books of our niche all time, I would say, basically. I mean, it begot a multi-million dollar consulting company. And so when Gino reached out to us to be on the podcast, by the way, all-time podcast pitch high right now, like 5 a day.
It's crazy.
It's crazy.
I don't know if it's like people have figured out that you can hire a VA to like pitch the person, or like what it is, but yeah, all-time high in terms of inquiries. But the Traction came out in a time where we were growing a business, and so one of the things that we were trying to figure out with actually Taylor Pearson's help at the time he worked for us was different systems in our business. I mean, we were just like a bunch of people just running around like chickens with their heads cut off, and I mean, around the same time we're reading other books like Getting Things Done, Work the System, and we're all trying to figure out like, okay, look, I think at the time it was like, got a couple $1 million coming through the front door. Like, we really got to focus, and we got to like sit down, and we got to prioritize basically creating systems and organizing this group, or else we're not going to be able to scale this thing.
Totally.
So the book came at a good time for us, and I think it came at a good time for a lot of people. And so, yeah, Gino reached out. He has a new book. It's called The Entrepreneurial Leap. And so we thought we would have him on the show. And I'm not sure how many of you listened to that, but it was an interesting podcast. And again, this is like, the talk behind the talk. I did that interview with Gino. And I'm interested to hear what you guys thought about in the comments here. And a couple of people left comments on the site too, on the Tropical MBA site. But I think one of the things that with Gino's new book that I realized is that there is, I'm not sure if there's a formula for becoming an entrepreneur, because that's basically what the book's idea was, like that it proposed. Like, if you want to get into this game, like there's just a formula for it. Like anybody can do it, basically.
What about the 1,000-day principle, man?
There is a 1,000-day principle.
I'm just kidding.
But when we're talking about formulas, I think one of the things that comes up, I mean, it's like you already have your back up against the wall when you decide that it's 1,000-day principle time, right? You're like, okay, man, I got to get into this. Like, I don't like the situation I'm in. I got to change my arrangement here.
Okay.
You know, but I think one of the things that doesn't resonate with Gino's new book is this idea that it's formulaic almost to get into this situation.
Yeah, it's more or less like kind of like a, you know, it's similar to like the Myers-Briggs personality thing where you get to like label yourself and self-identify, and then you can use like this simplification of something that's very complex to then take a next step. And, you know, that's the reality is like when you're dealing in the realm of ideas and idea brokering, that's what a lot of this stuff is. I mean, the 1,000-day principle is an abstraction of this super complex thing. It tries to get a point across that like all those question marks, just, you know, time's an important element. That's the point. And I think there are some methods though that cross lines, and one of those is when you try to identify an entrepreneurial personality. Might I mention why traction didn't resonate with me?
Rob Walling showed up and he said, "That's a principle, Mr. Andrews, not a formula." That's right.
That's right. That's good. I'll say this. After I read Traction, I'm into books like this. Like I love Work the System. I love GTD. But then I read Traction and I was sort of like, you know, that meme where the guy's holding up like the champagne glass, and I was like, cheers, entrepreneur. Because what I felt about that book was that it wasn't super generous. Okay. I was trying to describe earlier about the DC offers we have inside of our forum and what makes a good one and what makes a bad one. And often I find that people that are super ballers or just starting out are the ones that have the best offers because they're willing to give a lot. Whereas companies that are in the middle and really need to make sales, they often don't give quite as much for obvious reasons. Makes sense. Totally cool. But when I read Traction, what I felt like was the concept of the book was we all want this with our businesses, right? We want basically stress-free growth and this amazing organization and everything's going to be great. And it's going to be manageable and we're going to just stack that cash. Now, this book has those answers. But the way to get there becomes this Baroque maze of arbitrary structures that if you follow all of them will get you there. But of course, they're quite complex to follow. So now that I've demonstrated all of this complexity that leads to simplicity, of course, you can pay me to implement it.
Mm-hmm.
Cheers. And it worked out that way. Look, at the end of the day, there were hundreds of consultants working to implement this, what I thought was an overly Baroque and ultimately inhumane system. I'm not saying it's all bad stuff, and I think it can really work. And the reality is if your business is just a total heap of crazy concepts everywhere, then maybe it makes sense to just put some arbitrary systems in place and implement them and get everybody on the same page. So I'm all about it. There was just something like emotionally really that I was like, I know what this guy's doing. Like, this is great. This is too meta brilliant for me to buy into, you know? Anyway,
one other thing,
an interesting interview is the point.
It was an interesting experience for me, but one of the other things to mention about Traction and some of what's going on in like that community is one word that I started thinking about this with you actually after we did this interview is pedigree.
Yeah.
One of the things I've realized after I did that interview with Gino is that I ain't got no pedigree. Like I'm just like
you got pedigree.
I got something, but it's not that type of pedigree. Yeah. And I think when you take a look at what different people are up to in different businesses and whatnot, you realize that a lot of them might have gone to Princeton. A lot of them might have inherited businesses. A lot of them might be in certain circles that they were basically born into. And that it's not to say that you can't achieve and you can't get to these same circles, and maybe you don't even want to be in these circles in some cases, but there is, and I was certainly born with a certain amount of privilege, but
Oh, of course.
there is pedigree built
Got an
in.
amazing vertical leap.
Yeah, thank you. There is pedigree built into some of these different systems.
Yeah, and it's actually something that we've been talking about because we find it really fascinating and worth knowing about. It's not like a boo-hoo pedigree thing.
No.
It's like, hey, this is like a real thing. And on the opposite end, it can be an enormous limiter for people like us who are like, we're just these kind of people who we are, and then there'll be people who are in a different world saying, man, like, think bigger or think like this, or these people do this. But
Yeah.
sometimes that can be a trap too, because the just think bigger can be a clumsy abstraction for what is actually a bunch of privilege and pedigree at play.
Correct.
So I've seen this a lot with well, I'm not going to get into it right now, but I'm just going to posit. You posited the idea brilliantly, which is there's often a big story behind the story that's actually the story.
Yes.
Okay.
Now I think we're gonna roll. I think I'm done talking about that episode. But one thing I want to mention, Rob Walling, if you're still in the room here, my job all day was to get Dan to write you an email. He promised he was going to write you this email yesterday. I woke up, I was like, did you write Rob that email? He's like, nope. And then like around lunchtime, I was like, so what about that email to Rob? He's like, nope. I'm like, I'm done.
What does that mean? Like, you're the visionary and I'm the integrator? We got it backwards. So we were joking, like, what's the management structure and the division of responsibilities? Like, Ian's the kind of guy that tells me to write an email, and I'm the kind of guy that thinks about writing the email. And then eventually that responsibility goes back to Ian, where he evaluates the progress of said email. And I owe you an email, Rob.
You know, this all started to, like, my rationalization was so whack. It was like, you were the last person to talk to Rob, so you should have to write the email.
It's like, use any excuse to delegate. I absolutely love it. That's a true entrepreneur boss man. And the other running joke here at the pod shop, it's even gone with domestic chores and everything, which is I'm not a part of that process. It's Ian's favorite to say line. It's like, hey, how do you toast this bread? I'm not a part of that process. I just absolutely don't know. Shout out to producer Jane for that joke.
He says, Rob, give us a thumbs down. He said, dude, Dan, come on. And then Ed says, I'd say what you've got, Ian, is confidence. You've built a business. You've overcome failure and setbacks. You built some resilience. Someone at the start of the journey doesn't have the confidence. Yeah, that's right. I have the confidence to tell Dan, write that email.
Yeah, and he has the audacity to call that productivity.
That's right.
All right. So it's Friday. It's happy hour. We appreciate you all coming to join us. Any more shout outs or questions before we go here? You said there was one earlier in the chat that you wanted to address.
There was Andrew. Andrew asked, would you say a productized service still has the same scale issue as a service-based business? Hired my first employee this week and beginning the journey to scale beyond myself. Congratulations. That's awesome. So would you say a productized service still has the same scaling issue as a service-based business?
No. I mean, that's the whole point.
Explain.
The idea is, the idea is, where does the line between productized service and service get drawn? And we could sit here all day long and talk about different examples, but a basic idea of a service is that it adapts individually to every single client. Therefore, your cost of implementation is going to be higher, and the cost of the labor is going to be higher, because instead of having one person tinging out one part of the product, they're all of a sudden having to have a skill set where they can adjust to the client.
Yep.
And that's really where the scale issues come in, because you start talking about things like project managers and then account managers, and then how can that account manager take over that client that's really important to us, and will they eventually drop the ball and not make deliverables, or will they be able to re-up on the account? And all these questions are rendered more simple by the productized service, which is like, we know that people want to buy, this package from us, and this person does that element of the package, and this person does that element of the package. And I mean, so the problem with the discussion, I guess, just answering off the top of my head, is, I guess by definition, it's easier to scale. If it wouldn't be more productized. That's the idea.
Yeah, agree.
But of
Right.
course, there's just endless granularity there the whole way. So I'm not saying that it's a simple thing to scale a productized service by any means.
No, but I think that the coolest part about what Andrew said is that he's looking to scale beyond himself,
Totally.
which is a big deal.
I also point out that, on the other side of this, services scale enormously as well. There are some of the biggest companies in the world are services businesses. So it's not to say that services don't scale. It's just the ways in which they scale are often unsavory to lifestyle entrepreneurs or solo founders or co-founders that are looking to grow generational wealth. Typically, you find people with a multi-million-dollar service business, and it's not really. I don't know how far off the path I want to go down this services thing, but it is true that services can scale as well, of course.
Awesome. You guys have any questions that you want us to address? They can be personal. They can be based on our outfits, anything like that. Happy to address them over the next couple minutes. And then we're going to flip off the mics here, and I might get myself a real beer. Not a near beer, but a real beer.
A real beer. I am going to be going for a bicycle ride, and I'm going golfing tomorrow morning. So jacked with a podcast listener, actually that I met. Does anybody remember this website called Technorati? Now, I loved this website because it used to rank blogs, and I still read blogs every morning in Feedly. And so I called up the old CEO of Technorati to ask him what the hell happened. And the story was pretty juicy. It was pretty interesting. And so we did a whole episode about it. And then we ended up hanging out with this guy, and he ended up becoming a mentor of ours just because of one phone call for a podcast. And now he's taking me golfing tomorrow. So shout out RJ.
That's Richard Jalichandra. He's done a bunch of interesting things in his career. He was CEO of bodybuilding.com, and he's like the fixer-upper CEO. He's the guy that goes in there when stuff isn't going so well and throws some elbows and makes it work. Greg Berry says, are there DC Austin 2020 t-shirts? That's funny. That's actually funny. Okay, so what happened was, we basically waited until the last minute, obviously, to see what was going to go on with this COVID thing. And we didn't order t-shirts because it was one of these things that they're domestically made and we can kind of wait till the last minute. But that being said, I do think we should open a merch site.
Yeah, totally. So that we can buy our own merch.
Exactly.
The number one, you be your own best customer.
Exactly.
Yeah. This is my friend's advice about why you shouldn't open a bar, because he said you never want to start a business where you'll be your best customer, especially if it's a bar. That's why I haven't opened up a t-shirt shop.
All right. Awesome. Andrew chimes back in and says, appreciate this. Realize my service isn't fully productized. Need to move toward that direction. Yeah, if it works for you.
It's complex, but that's the thing. If it works for you, for sure. That's definitely the push that we've always made in our careers. And shoot us over an email and let us know what it is, and we'd be happy to take a look at it.
And again, like a lot of times you don't know this stuff until you get through your first 3,000 days or your 1,000 days or your 5 days. Sometimes it shows up for different people at different times. Dan and I worked at a company that served clients, and we said never again. I mean, it was never just again. That simple. And then we're probably going to do it again, but never again for like the next 10 years.
That's right. All right, everybody.
Thank you so
Friday.
much.
Have a wonderful weekend. We hope you're all doing well. Again, if you have a moment this weekend, click that link below. We are going to write up a blog post where we link to everybody who shared their story. You can remain anonymous if you like. These 1,000-day stories are really inspiring to us, and we're starting to see patterns and put them out there in the world to help others take advantage of this all-time build opportunity. The costs have, never been lower in the past 10 years to build a new business.
That's right.
Not only factor in labor and rent and everything else, employees, but how about technology changes? There's a lot of people out there building like SaaS apps with just a bunch of Zapiers. There's Zaps, and why not? You can do that. Forget about SWAS, just have a ZAS or whatever, and maybe that's the next business you could build. So it's a really exciting time for those that want to build something, and hopefully your stories of the 1,000 days can inspire them.
Have a great weekend, guys, and Rob, look for that email from Dan. See you guys.